lexicon, so to speak, that we're trying to develop. Hold on. Okay. So just to, before I jump into what degrowth means in the Indian context, what exactly is degrowth? So here I would like to point out that we're moving from the elephant motif to a snail motif. And I will be sharing a lot of snails here. So what is degrowth? Essentially what I read somewhere described very nicely was slowing down the metabolism of the economy, which I thought was a very nice way to put it. It is essentially an idea that calls for the abolishment of looking at economic growth as the utmost objective. So it's not the same as a recession or slowing down growth. So it's not about doing less of the same economic activities, but it's also more about transforming the economy itself, the sort of activities that we participate in and the way that we participate in them. So what it does is it focuses not just on the economic aspect of growth, but also the social aspects of it. Right. And one of the key ideas of degrowth is to move away from what I would call the conventional notions or parameters of development, such as the obsession with GDP or per capita income as our economies are currently judged or ranked. So the idea for degrowth, I think it's been in the making for the past 3-4 decades now, but a lot of the shift towards degrowth has been because of the disappointment that came with, I mean, it's a harsh term, but failures of sustainable development or green growth because even when you're using the term sustainable development or green growth, you're still talking about the same economic systems, which are inherently based on exploitation of resources and of the masses for the growth of a small minority. So, and also greenwashing. I mean, in the name of sustainable development, the kind of activities that are taking place are basically the same as they were before. They just have a new shiny green wrapper now. So degrowth targets not just the economic system, but it also requires you to target inherent social inequalities and examine environmental justice as a goal. So that is how degrowth developed in the international context. So it started out initially in Europe, in France, and then Italy, and that was the reigning discourse. But when you come to degrowth in what is called the global south, what does it mean for an economy to go into degrowth in the Indian context? Because it's the same argument that we have when it comes to climate action, that we do have these impoverished masses that do need to be uplifted out of their current economic conditions. And how do you reconcile that with a call for whether it be cutting down carbon emissions or what you're calling for, or basically economic revolution, a different way of looking at the economy. So one school of thought that exists here vis-a-vis degrowth is that in the case of Europe, where it calls for looking at a completely novel approach to the economy, in the case of India, it's more about preserving systems that are already in place or that are dying out. So, for example, values such as community sharing or self-sufficiency or respect or ecosystem worship. So values that are already found here, usually in a rural or tribal context, not so much um, around us, but more of preserving those systems and allowing those systems to thrive. Um, And also another argument for degrowth in India is that the externalities of the conventional growth model are already apparent. That the country might see a certain amount of GDP growth, but where exactly is that wealth accumulating? And is it actually uplifting the people in whose name this is being done out of poverty or not? It's also led to appropriation of resources away from tribal communities, rural communities, land, forests, water, um, away from the commons to into private hands. So ideally, what would a degrowth model in India look like? Um, a lot of it borrows from the ideology of Farage. So self-governance and autonomy, especially when it comes to indigenous communities, and also focusing less on producing more wealth, so a less focus on capital production and more on equitable distribution of what already exists. And yeah, my closing statement is trickle down is a lie, and that um, it's a system that has failed elsewhere and it cannot be expected to work here. Yeah.
Is that it?
Yes. More in question answer.
Okay. So if you have a question, you should raise your hand or just start speaking, one or the other. The first person can start speaking, then on, I think it's better if you raise your hand. Okay, so Naina, oh, are you clapping? Okay. Maybe if you are clapping, you might as well raise your hand and say something.
No, yeah, I was clapping. This was awesome. Thank you so much, Aprajita. So I don't have a question, Rajesh. Thanks for putting me on the spot. But I completely agree with degrowth in the Indian context, and even for Greenup, how do we start looking at it from the beginning when we're designing for communities from like a degrowth perspective? So I don't particularly have a question, but up for discussion if people want to pivot to something.
Any other hands? Rita and then Kavya.
My first question is, who drew the elephants? They were very, I couldn't look away.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, the second question is, I don't know, I've seen that politically a term like degrowth is something that is uh, maybe not the most attractive thing in the current situation in India. So how would we get that traction in fields which is not just academic or already sustainability leaning?
So I cannot take credit for the elephants. Those are from the Degrowth website. Sorry to disappoint in that regard. But the name itself, Degrowth. So I mean, you're right. If amongst English speakers, especially, it has a sort of negative connotation because that's how we're conditioned to think about growth. And the term first originated in other languages, I believe French, where, within that context, it has a different meaning. And yeah, that's something that I was also thinking about, that perhaps the name itself is maybe holding people back from exploring it. But I think we have an opportunity here, because I could not find much material on this. We have an opportunity to create our own version of it in regional languages. Sort of like look for more friendly terms, terms that are a bit more approachable and less daunting than degrowth.
Kavya?
Thanks so much, Aprajita. Yeah, I don't have questions in the sense that I'm fully on board, but I have questions in terms of the operationalization, which I think is always tricky, and that's what you spoke to. I'm curious about your thoughts on whether it might be more sensible or it might make more sense to advocate for degrowth within urban contexts, because a lot of the wealth inequality and the ways the consumption patterns of growth are heavily leaning towards that. And then I guess the second question is the piece of how degrowth, a lot of degrowth activists, as far as I understand, often a lot of the work is advocating for degrowth in the global north as a result of helping the global south, for example, like canceling debt. So is that going to be a part of this vision of degrowth in India, or is it very much focusing within ways of trying to normalize degrowth here? I don't know if that makes sense. They're kind of two slightly different questions.
So degrowth, I think by its very definition, there have to be grassroots movements everywhere. So I mean, specifically for the urban context, definitely, as you said, there are inherent inequalities. But it's also extremely important for the rural context, because if you look at the transfer of wealth and the transfer of resources, so that is quite apparent and great in volume, from rural to urban, whether it be people, whether it be natural resources. So yeah, in that sense, I think, especially if you're looking at principles such as autonomy, it is equally important in both rural and um, urban context. I guess what I'm trying to say is you can't really look at them in as closed systems. There are interactions between both of them, which are also majorly contributing to the current issue. And those also need to be kept in mind um, in whatever a degrowth model would look like. And um, about the debt cancellation, I don't have an answer for that. But I mean, in terms of climate justice, then a transfer of funds is an intrinsic part of it. So perhaps I think any degrowth model would also have to look at um, financial transfers from the global north to the global south.
Arvind, you have some things in the chat window. Maybe you can say a few things.
Yeah. So, I mean, I wrote it down to also organize thoughts in my head. I can, I mean, I can see that Aparajita, the way you're saying it, it's not about, depriving people of who have not yet experienced, let's say, even reasonable amount of prosperity and and degrowth for them. But I was just thinking, and this is not just a positioning, right? How do you position it? But I want to push it further to say that it seems elitist, right? We can afford degrowth. How can 90% of India afford the degrowth? What is there for them to degrow from? Not to take away from the from a more sustainable way of living and things like that.
Right. No, I mean, you're absolutely right. Any such discussions have to account for the fact that, like, I am and the people present here are also coming from a place of privilege. But I see degrowth as a solution to that problem rather than like a part of the problem itself, because we're talking about, so I mean, personal aspirations are a different thing, and that I don't have an answer for. But
No, I agree. I'm just saying, can we all, for example, think through, take an example of somebody, some person who is not present here, and
yeah,
think from their perspective how it will be. Whether that will be a good way to imagine.
right. Yeah, it is a difficult idea to um, push for, to translate for somebody who comes from um, like a not as privileged background. So I think when we talk about enabling ownership and autonomy, sort of giving people control over their own situation and resources, perhaps that is a better way of going about it than making them a part of a system and hoping that wealth created at the top is eventually going to um, uh, reach them at some point in the future.
Achur?
Essentially the same point as Arvind said. I think the phrase degrowth will not, I mean, for most people who are looking for growth and moving up in life, right? I mean, degrowth just sounds like, okay, so what does that mean? So we need a different framing than degrowth. I mean, if we have to emphasize the other aspects of what we're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like I said, I think this is perhaps an opportunity for us to be at the forefront of such a reframing, um, because that is a gap, as you pointed out.
All right, maybe one more question, and then I'll summarize, and then we can quit.
I don't have a question, but to continue Aprajita's thought and what Arvind brought up, right, Rajesh? So I was thinking if we are for Greenup looking at the concept of degrowth, and we don't necessarily have to say degrowth, but if our outcome is still more autonomy, more rights towards communities, we can technically just work for and like justice related, or like, you know, when we're talking about say tribal or indigenous rights, say talk about like land rights for them, etc. So giving them more autonomy, but essentially not calling it degrowth, but working around those like principles of what Aprajita just discussed without actually mentioning the term, or figuring out what vernacular languages have around this, right? So it maybe, like she said, in French, it means something different and not a negative connotation, but something for our group to sort of explore in vernacular terms as well.
I think that's a good point. And I mean, to some extent, so let me just see if I can summarize it. First of all, I love the snail. Right? I feel like that we are slowly building our animal vocabulary. So maybe with the Greenup Lexicon, we'll also have for every talk. So for this is whoever does it next time, you're gonna have to bring an animal to the talking. It has to be your animal. So that's great, and thank you first of all, Aprajita, for putting this together. And I think if we set aside the hiccup of how to call it in India, you know, this kind of given that everybody has aspirations, what kind of framing it needs to be acceptable, that's a separate issue. I think that foregrounding, and that's there in this last slide, the idea of Swaraj and autonomy and flourishing is actually what the shift is about, right? It's going away from growth and the economy being the most important driver of society to flourishing and community and ecology, right? And I think that that's a very powerful new way, and how we can And given that most Indians have neither experienced prosperity nor flourishing nor autonomy, I think we do have an opportunity to foreground that aspect, that, you know, a life of dignity is actually something that is as aspirational as a life of prosperity. I mean, that I think is a good framing for us. So with that, I want to thank Aprajita. Let's have a little, I don't know how to do this online, but maybe we can all clap somewhere. I'm looking for my clap sign. Where is my clap sign? Yeah, there we go. So thank you.
So I've also put the other idea that I was saying earlier. I think we are getting too businessy. We come and talk only, shop and go back. So I have a quiz which I have prepared. Maybe we can find a time. And it's yeah. So I'm going to try it out tomorrow with a bunch of my friends. So I'll also know how it is received.
Okay.
The only thing is it's going to be easier for those born before 85. That's my.
I think born before 1985 is a rarity in this group.
That's why. That's why people like you and me. Arunabha.
So, nevertheless, okay. Well, we will look forward to your quiz. So maybe we can keep adding these little quirks, right? So next time you have to come with whoever. So first of all, let's find out who wants to go next. Not only do you have to come up with a good idea, you have to come up with an animal that represents that idea. I think that's, and retrospectively, I have to think of one for myself. But I think, I guess elephant, I own the elephant. So there you go. I'm done. All right, who wants to go next week? No show of hands. I mean, I might have to be a dictator and nominate. So I'm giving like 2 more seconds for somebody to self-nominate. Otherwise, then I'm going to do it. Well, since Arvind is going to prepare the quiz, you might as well prepare the rest of the talk too. So, Arvind, it's you. Oh, you don't. You can't nominate someone else, Arvind. Next time you nominate the next person. So this is it. That's how we.
Hey, that's how it should be. Aprajita should have made. Why should you have these dictatorial rights?
Okay, fine. Aprajita, you can nominate somebody. Go ahead. You are muted.
You're on mute, Aprajita. I heard a prachur. I heard you say prachur. You're still on mute.
I didn't say prachur. What I said was, since Arvind has already been nominated, I think let's just.
Okay.
No, Aprajita is saying she's going to nominate someone she hasn't spoken to earlier.
Okay, theek hai, chalo. I'll do it next week. Now on the topic, actually the topic I wanted to prepare on, and which I'm not prepared so much, is I was just thinking about how we could how we could think about the Indian culture values in the context of Greenup, and not, I mean, with both with the air quotes and without the air quotes, right?
Okay.
So I don't know whether 1 week is enough. Yeah, I'll try.
Yeah, you have. So, I mean, Aprajita has given you a leading, like basically she can do a handoff, right? She's ended with Swaraj. So you've got that whole Indian culture framing right here at the end of this session.
At least the animal is clear. I'll get mine from you.
Good.
Okay.
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Hi, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
So our usual thing is you come online with your video on, say bye, and then go away. Bye.
Everyone.